That's right. Bear down, Bears fans. It's time for another edition of the Chicago Bears podcast, Bears Banter, powered by Second City Gridiron. Bill Zimmerman with you, and it is a glorious day to be a Chicago Bears fan. It's a glorious week to be a Chicago Bears fan, and hopefully it will be a glorious year and years to come to be a Chicago Bears fan. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. We'll get into all of it on this episode of Bears Banter. Thanks for joining me. Excited for the guest we've got coming up. I think this is a good one. I think this is going to be a compelling interview. Rick Smith is going to be joining me. Who's Rick Smith, you might ask? Well, that would be the agent of one Ben Johnson. That's right. From Priority Sports, we're going to talk to Rick. We're going to talk about what it's like working with coaches here, getting them hired, everything going on. We'll talk everything in this aspect, and we will get into as much Ben Johnson and his decision to sign with the Bears, and as much as Rick is willing to give us there about that decision and what went into it. But this is a great day for the Chicago Bears for many, many reasons. And let's start with Ben Johnson himself. Then we'll talk about what Ben Johnson means. But Ben Johnson himself is first of all, he is the top candidate and has been the top candidate for multiple years in the head coaching cycle, just didn't take jobs. This is kind of like, if you're old enough, Tim Duncan, of course, drafted by the Spurs. Tim Duncan stayed at Wake Forest for 4 years, but Tim Duncan would have been the number one pick in the draft every year, but he kept staying at school. That's Ben Johnson, like at least the last 2 years, but maybe even the last 3, where he was a hot commodity with what he had been doing with Jared Goff in Detroit, but kept returning to Detroit for whatever the reason is. Obviously, you'd have to ask Ben Johnson exactly why he wanted to stay in Detroit. Unfinished business, happy there. Maybe he didn't feel he was ready to be a head coach, whatever it might be. But Ben Johnson kept deciding to return to Detroit. So when we get to this year, it's my opinion that Ben Johnson really kind of had to take a job this year. And you could sit there and say, like Mike Florio saying he could go back to Detroit. If he went back to Detroit, that would have crushed him, I think, in terms of how he's viewed as a coaching candidate, because you can't just keep turning down jobs. Now, the first time he turns down the job with the Carolina Panthers, okay, I don't think anyone bats an eye. Last year, it looked like he was headed to Washington, and then he pulls his name out at kind of the last minute there. They have to pivot to Dan Quinn, and everyone goes, oh, okay. But this year, when you've got multiple jobs on the table for you, that you are going to have your pick of the job, and you have an opportunity to coach Caleb Williams, you have an opportunity to coach Trevor Lawrence, or you have an opportunity to go to Las Vegas and work with Tom Brady. If you chose to turn down all 3 of those jobs and go back to Detroit again, at that point, I think, because look, there is no perfect job, right? Like, you have to understand that when you are the coach and you go into a new position, you're going to be a culture setter. You're going to be a big reason why things get turned around. It's not like the Kansas City Chiefs are just going to let Andy Reid retire and then say, hey, Ben Johnson, come on over. That's not the type of thing. Plus, what kind of challenge is that? That would leave questions for Ben Johnson. So you have to go into a position where you can have an opportunity to turn things around and be the reason, the agent of change for that. So when Ben Johnson turns down a couple jobs, okay. If he turned down jobs this year, I think the NFL perception of him would have started to shift. Does he not really want to be a head coach? Is he questioning if he can be a head coach? What's holding him back? And then, of course, there's always the opportunity that the offense could regress and that Ben Johnson's star doesn't shine quite as bright. All those things are on the table. So I think Ben Johnson really had to take a job this year. especially with the jobs that were on the table. So obviously he chooses the Chicago Bears, and what he brings to the Chicago Bears, sure, there's questions here. Nobody knows for certain if this is going to be a home run hire. And I see some people over the last couple of months going, oh, well, Matt Nagy was the home run hire, and look what happened there. Well, one, Matt Nagy is the best coach the Bears have had since Lovie Smith prior to Ben Johnson. We'll see if Ben takes that platform, that title, and I think he will. But the other thing that a lot of people overlooked, and they don't overlook it anymore, is the play calling aspect that Matt Nagy did not do. He had not been a play caller. He was a first-time play caller. And I think as Bears fans, we've especially learned just how challenging it can be to be a good play caller at the NFL level, because we've seen so many offensive coordinators struggle with it with the Chicago Bears. So Ben Johnson is a totally different hire than Matt Nagy because of the play calling aspect. This is not a guy that has been play calling for half a season or got to play call a couple games like Nagy did at the end of that year with the Chiefs. No, this is a guy who has been a play caller for 3 years. He's been doing it for 50 plus games already. He has already started to hone his skill. And that's the thing. He can continue to get better as a play caller. We're not saying we've hit peak Ben Johnson. We can continue to see Ben Johnson get better as a play caller. And with Caleb Williams, you have a quarterback that is far more talented than Jared Goff. And Jared Goff has made himself, thanks to his work with Ben Johnson, a top 10 quarterback in the NFL, which is hard to say based on those first several years he had. And then Sean McVay kind of propped him up and traded him when he was like, I can't win with this guy. And now maybe you can't win with this guy because the Lions clearly haven't either. But now you've had Jared Goff have some sustained success with two brilliant offensive minds, don't get me wrong. And it'll be curious to see what Jared Goff does with Ben Johnson with the Chicago Bears now, to see how much regression is there going to be, or has he really come into his own? Is that next offensive coordinator in Detroit, whoever it's going to be? I mean, you don't expect him to be as good as Ben Johnson, but will they also be an elite play caller? Those are all questions the Detroit Lions are going to have to figure out, and the fans are going to have to see what happens with that moving forward. But Ben Johnson, the other idea that I want to combat here is Ben Johnson's system in Detroit would not be a good fit for Jared Goff. And that's where I think people don't truly understand Ben Johnson. And people I've talked to who are media people who are Lions fans or media people in Detroit, the one thing you have to remember, and I think most Bears fans know this now, is that Ben Johnson made that offense specifically. He created an offense around Jared Goff's skills. So when you sit there and say, well, Ben Johnson's offense is tailor-made for Jared Goff, the reason it is because he created it to be tailor-made for Jared Goff. So when he sits down with Caleb Williams this offseason, they're going to talk about where Caleb Williams' strengths and weaknesses are. And obviously his weaknesses, Ben Johnson is going to want to clean up, help, improve, do whatever he can there. But those strengths is what he's going to harness. And he's going to lean into Caleb Williams' strengths, and he's going to create an offense. Sure, he's going to want Caleb to do some things differently, and he's going to teach him that. But he is going to create an offense that utilizes Caleb Williams' strengths. That's the whole thing of the Ben Johnson offense. Yes, it's a Sean McVay offense, but it's a hybrid, and it's what he creates. So when people are like, well, what's Ben Johnson's offense going to look like in Chicago? What's great about that is we don't really know. We can, certain things that he likes that we can expect to see implemented in the offense, sure. But the exact what this offense will be, we don't know what it is yet because he hasn't created it. He is going to create something unique for Caleb Williams, and that's going to be a lot of fun to see that unfold this year. So with Ben Johnson, we're going to see how he handles as a head coach. Looks like Dennis Allen might be his defensive coordinator, a guy who has been a head coach, has that experience, going to be a good guy potentially for him to lean on. That makes a lot of sense. I think that's a really smart idea to have a defensive coordinator that has some experience there, not just another promotion. Like that's what we talked about with Matt Eberflus's coaching staff when he first was brought in. There was no experience there. These guys were all baby coaches. They were all, Matt Eberflus, first-time head coach. Alan Williams, first-time defensive coordinator. Luke Getsy, first-time offensive coordinator. All these guys had received promotions to join this coaching staff. So there wasn't a lot of experience here. Ben Johnson's going to have that with Dennis Allen. I understand Dennis Allen wasn't a good head coach, but he was a head coach. He will have some nuggets of wisdom to give to Ben Johnson. So I think that makes a lot of sense. We're going to see how Ben commands the room. We're going to see how he is as a head coach. We'll see how he is as a CEO on the sidelines. He's a pretty smart, analytical guy. I mean, look, we don't know if he's going to panic. Hasn't been his job. It's been Dan Campbell's job to handle that. Obviously, Matt Eberflus panicked. He froze in those situations. So hopefully Ben Johnson is calm and cool on the sidelines, makes the right decisions, and the Chicago Bears, move forward in the right direction with Ben Johnson. So we'll see how that goes. But what we do know is that this offense is going to hum. Not saying it's going to be the number one offense in the league, but I think it's going to be top 10 in the league. I really do. At worst, 10, 12. This is not going to be the 21st offense in the league. I think Ben Johnson and Ryan Poles are going to sit down. They're going to figure out how to beef up the offensive line, who they can get, who they can't, what guys they should retain, which guys maybe they should move on from. They're going to beef up this line. I'm not saying it's going to be a top line in the league next year, but I think it will be significantly improved. And I'm curious to see who they bring in as the offensive line coach, because Chris Morgan was bad. Like there is no defending Chris Morgan unless one of Chris Morgan's relatives on a burner account is in your mentions telling you how Chris Morgan has been robbed and he's, is totally not the problem and whatever. Yeah, no. Chris Morgan has been a big problem with that offensive line. When Brian Baldinger, who was an offensive lineman in the NFL and analyzes line play for a living, literally is trying to break down Bears film and doesn't understand what the assignments are. He can't figure it out. It made no sense to him. Multiple times he said this. That's Chris Morgan. That's a mess of an offense. And that was a major problem for the Chicago Bears for the last several years. And why they retained him, no one will ever know. But he has not been retained. He is gone. It is outstanding to see that he is no longer the Chicago Bears offensive line coach. I hate to cheer people losing their jobs, but he should not have been there in the first place. Now, what's also exciting about this Ben Johnson hire is how things are changing at Halas Hall. And that is Kevin Warren and that is George McCaskey. We'll get to Ryan Poles here in a second. But George McCaskey, and I've said this, and the bottom line here is George McCaskey knew that he wants to win. He's a good guy and he wants to win, but he is not good at this job. And I think from a football operations side, I think George finally started realizing over the last few years that he is not good at this job, that he needs help. And that help couldn't be Ted Phillips. He needs a more seasoned executive with a little better understanding about how football operations should work. So he goes out and he gets Kevin Warren. And I know Chicago Bears fans a lot of them have turned Kevin Warren into the boogeyman. And I don't really understand why. Like, I don't understand. Like, did you think Kevin Warren was going to come in, and just make massive changes and have the shovel in the ground on the stadium in 2 months? Like, this is a slow process. I've said this from the gate. Like, we're not going to see huge changes overnight at Halas Hall. They're going to take some time because Kevin Warren is here to change the philosophy at Halas Hall. Halas Hall has operated as a mom and pop shop. Like, that's what it is, because this is a family that has no major corporate experience, does not, they've just grown up with football and seen their asset continue to grow until it's worth billions of dollars. They aren't independently wealthy. They didn't have success on their own. They are just simply inheriting what George Halas created. And that's it. So they have to kind of grow into this job. It's nepotism is what it is. We know what it is, but this is the Chicago Bears franchise. It's a family-run company, but it's also now a billion-dollar corporation. So at some point in like 1978, when the NFL's big, but it's not huge, and your team is worth what, maybe $50 million, whatever it might be, $25 million. It wasn't worth that much. I understand that's a lot of money, but that can be run more as a mom and pop shop. And that's kind of okay. But then as things continue to grow, the Bears didn't grow with the NFL. And then they were playing catch up because they didn't know what to do. So now Kevin Warren is here, who has run billion-dollar corporations, in essence, with the Vikings, with the Big Ten, and has that experience, has that knowledge, knows how things have to be done, starts making changes, says you don't have enough senior level executives, hires multiple new senior level executives to handle all aspects of football, both business side and operationally, gets into football operations, assesses football operations, and starts changing the mentality there. George McCaskey used to wear that as a badge of pride that he had never fired a coach in season. And then after the season, again, he had said that he's proud that they operate that way. And after the season, he goes, well, things change, basically is what he said, right? He says, the opportunity needed to happen, so we did it. He goes, just because what we did in the past, it doesn't mean that's what we need to do in the present. Like all his, lines that he gave us in those year-end press conferences. But George McCaskey, thanks to Kevin Warren, and yes, you have to tip your cap to George McCaskey for, saying yes, but for Kevin Warren, who sits George down and goes, look, it is not fair to the players. It is not fair to the fans. And it is not going to help us in 2025. We know November of 2024, we know that Matt Eberflus cannot stay as the head coach of the Chicago Bears. So letting him stay for the next 6 weeks is a pointless exercise. We need to move on now. We have an opportunity. We can elevate Thomas Brown and kind of give him a look and see how he does as a head coach, because that's someone Ryan Poles is going to want to interview off our current staff. We'll see how he does. And if he does well, we can consider him. And if he doesn't do well, we got our answer there. We need to move forward. And George McCaskey said, okay. George McCaskey ate over 2 years of a contract, something he has never done. George McCaskey, the most he'd ever eaten was Mark Trestman, 2 years of a contract. Now, 2 years and 5 games of a contract. Like, he's willing to make those hard moves, something he had not done before. And that is Kevin Warren, and that is kind of the agent of change there at Hallis Hall. We talked about agent of change on the field. Kevin Warren has been the agent of change at Hallis Hall. And I do think, and now Kevin Warren has said it, Tom Pelissero has said it, that the Bears will be breaking ground. I said it, months ago, but nobody wants to listen to me. The Bears will be breaking ground on a stadium in 2025. And I think that's interesting there. I think, George McCaskey would probably want to see it in Arlington Heights. That's a piece of property that him and Ted Phillips purchased together. They probably had a vision of what that could be. But now at the same time, Kevin Warren comes in, and Kevin Warren seems pretty adamant that he wants a city in Chicago. They've got that Michael Reese site there on the kind of the south side. What's it, around 31st Street, whatever it might be, near the lake. That might be where it ends up going. And that is, I think, what Kevin Warren visualizes in terms of having this world-class facility, right? I think he just sees the aerial shots out on Lake Michigan. I mean, we see it with Soldier Field, but the aerial shots out on Lake Michigan with the skyline behind the stadium, and the stadium just beautifully situated on the lake. Like, I think that's what Kevin visualizes, and to build up the area around it, but to have it in the city of Chicago. I think that's really important for Kevin Warren's vision. And we'll see if he can get it done. Obviously, he's got to deal with politicians, and things seem to be shifting, right? Like, they seem to be shifting there with Illinois and the city of Chicago in terms of taxes and public dollars. So we'll see what progresses here over the next few months. Because as I said on a previous podcast, I don't remember exactly which one, when everyone's like, well, why is there no movement on the stadium? There's no movement on the stadium in 2024 because it was an election year. Plain and simple. And you don't get elected if you are promising to send people's money to professional sports teams that are billionaires. That's how you get elected. That does not work. People do not like having to pay. But if you get people to say, all right, some of your taxes are going to go to this football stadium in 2025, you got plenty of years before you need to be elected again. That's just the way this goes. So the Chicago Bears, I think, Kevin Warren's going to work some deals. He'll get the finances he needs. The NFL, I'm sure, is going to pitch in as well. And the Chicago Bears will have a new stadium here. It'll break ground this year. They'll have it done in the next, couple years, whatever it might be, world-class facility. And the city of Chicago will get a Super Bowl in so they break ground here. Maybe it opens in 2028. Maybe by about 2030, the city of Chicago will host a Super Bowl. That's going to be pretty cool. So we see Halas Hall's mentality changing. And the last thing on that is George McCaskey and the fact that he opened his wallet. We haven't heard the exact reports on what Ben Johnson's contract is. We may never get those reports specifically as to what it is. But what we do know is it's a massive, massive contract. And if Matt Eberflus was probably the highest paid coach in Chicago Bears history, maybe Matt Nagy was, I think it was Eberflus, you're probably looking at about a 5-year, $30 million deal, something like that, 25 million, something like that for Matt Eberflus. Suddenly, Ben Johnson is going to have a contract worth at least 2, maybe 3 times that much money. That is a huge, huge change for how George McCaskey is operated. And that, again, goes to Kevin Warren, who says if we are a world-class organization, we need to spend money like a world-class organization. And they have. And then we get to Ryan Poles. And then I'll close up with the Raiders smoke and the coaching staff, which I don't have much on the coaching staff. I'll just tell you now. Ryan Poles. I give Ryan Poles credit. He wanted Ben Johnson. He told George and Kevin he wanted Ben Johnson. Give George credit. George said, go out and get Ben Johnson, and Ryan Poles did. Now, am I in on Ryan Poles now? No. I still have serious questions about Ryan Poles. And I have said, even in my criticisms of Ryan Poles, that I think the process that he has put himself in has always been sound in terms of draft picks and free agent signings and not overspending and creating cap space. Like, he understands that aspect of football operations well. I think Ryan Poles is solid in there. But what you have to look at with Ryan Poles is evaluation. The evaluation of Matt Eberflus was not good. Dan Wiederer was pretty adamant in his article. I've heard similar things. Ryan Poles wanted to keep Matt Eberflus at the end of the 2024 season. Is that 100%? Do I know that for sure? No, I don't. But it does seem to be that there is enough media buzz that was probably the case. Now, would it have been on the table if Ryan wanted to make a change? We don't know. But what we can surmise that most likely Ryan Poles wanted to keep Matt Eberflus. That in January of 2024, 1 year ago, he still felt that Matt Eberflus was the right guy to run this team. That's a question. That is an issue that you have to keep in mind with Ryan Poles. Some of the other decisions he's made in terms of evaluating on the field, and he was a big part of bringing in Shane Waldron. A big part of Shane Waldron, and that was a failure for multiple reasons on and off the field, and that's a problem. And then the evaluations on the field, not knowing when to take a risk. And I know people like Darnell Wright, and if you don't want Jalen Carter, that's fine. But he passes on Jalen Carter for Darnell Wright, but he'll go out and trade a second-round pick for Chase Claypool. And Chase Claypool had issues in Pittsburgh. So he's got to make those decisions. He'll listen to coaches to sign DeAndre Swift or to sign Tremaine Edmonds, but then he will ignore coaches and go out and sign Nate Davis. So when is he listening to his coaches on things and when is he not? And if you look at how much money Tremaine Edmonds has gotten, he hasn't lived up to that contract. DeAndre Swift had a lower cap hit this year than Saquon Barkley. That was not a good signing, and they still have more guaranteed money for DeAndre Swift next year. So you can question some of these signings. Caleb Williams, look, the trade with Carolina was awesome. But Caleb Williams, like the evaluation to draft Caleb Williams, he doesn't get a pat on the back. That's like saying Ryan Grigson deserves a pat on the back for Andrew Luck. Like, these are just, you knew that was the draft pick. If we got, Joe Sixpack out of the Cubby Bear on June 15th and said, who should the number one pick be? He would have said Caleb Williams. Like, that's what it is. Like, everybody knew that. So there's not some big applause of an evaluation there from Ryan Poles. So there are still questions with Ryan Poles. Now with Ben Johnson here, he's going to be able to lean on Ben Johnson. We don't know how much Ben Johnson was involved in certain aspects of personnel in Detroit. If he was and has a strong player evaluation, he's going to get leaned on. He's going to be part of the process, and he's going to help bring people in to his offense and onto his roster, and we will see where this goes moving forward. But no, I am not in on Ryan Poles. I do want to see Ryan Poles get extended. I really don't want to see a new GM here in I know that sounds crazy, but I don't want to see a new GM here in 2026, where you get the quarterback in 2024, the head coach in 2025, and the GM in 2026. Bears can't keep doing stuff backwards. Align everything here, and let's move forward and see where we go. That's where I am with Ryan Poles. Now, finally, I didn't want to start with this because I thought it was a little too egotistical. But yeah, the Raiders stuff, which I fully bought into. I admit it. Fully got that wrong. Total swing and a miss, a total whiff. Had a huge whiff with Jalen Carter. Same thing. Smoke screen that torched me. Same thing here. Clearly, this Raiders thing was a smoke screen and it torched me. And kind of going through the process, like when this regular season ended and the Jaguars retained Trent Baalke, I was like, you can cross the Jaguars off Ben Johnson's list. It's over. Some people said, well, they could still fire Trent Baalke, which obviously they have now, and they're getting Liam Cohen because of it. But to me, Ben Johnson, one of the things he was concerned about was ownership and having the right leadership in place. So you're going to trust an owner who, one, doesn't even know how many games are in an NFL regular season. Go listen to his year-end press conference. That's not BS. You're going to trust an owner who doesn't know anything about the league, kept his GM, and then fired him because you told that's unstable. That's not when that happened, I was like, well, that's out. I can't see Ben Johnson going to Jacksonville. And the Raiders had no quarterback and had no clear path to a quarterback. And I was like, there's no way he's going to go to the Raiders. So I'm like, if the Patriots go with Mike Vrabel, I don't see how Ben Johnson isn't a member of the Chicago Bears. I tweeted it. I was like, he's coming. There's no way he's not. Then the Raiders smoke started, that he was intrigued by it. The Raiders loved him. The Raiders were enamored with him. The Raiders fired Tom Telesco days after the season ended. And oddly enough, after they requested Ben Johnson and right before Ben Johnson interviewed with them. And suddenly it was like, well, this Telesco thing is so Johnson can bring his GM that he wants with him. Whoever that was Lance Newmark was a rumor, whoever that was. And Ben Johnson is going to go to the Raiders. And when I heard that initially, and I even tweeted this, I said, if you're Ben Johnson and his agent and you want to go to the Chicago Bears, the best way for you to make that happen and get a big contract is going to be to convince the Bears that the team that once gave John Gruden $100 million wants to pay Ben Johnson as well. That's going to get the Bears to pony up. So I was sitting there, I'm like, Ben Johnson has to go to the Bears, and the Raiders are just leverage for that to happen. That's where I was. Then I start making phone calls and texts around the league. And I get, okay, hey, no, this Ben Johnson to the Raiders thing is real. This Ben Johnson's thing to the Raiders is real. Sorry, but I don't think he wants the Bears. I think he wants the Raiders. I think he wants to work with Tom Brady. I think he's excited to kind of start from scratch and build up a whole team, from scratch. All these things I'm hearing from people that I can tell you have given me great information that has been accurate. When I have broken some stories here or there on the timeline, it came from these people that I was talking to. They have good contacts, but they whiffed here, and I listened to them, and I whiffed. And I brought it to the timeline, and I said, I think the Ben Johnson to the Raiders stuff is real. I expect him to go to the Raiders because that was that much smoke around that. And Bears fans are in my mentions. Why would he go to the Raiders? They have no quarterback. Mark Davis is a boob. I get it. I don't disagree with any of that. I was just going with what the flow was, what people felt was going to happen. They were wrong, gloriously, gloriously wrong. I was gloriously, gloriously wrong. I will happily eat crow. You can jump in my mentions all you want and call me a moron. Call me I don't know anything. I don't have contacts. Any of that stuff. I don't care. Ben Johnson is the head coach of the Chicago Bears. And to wrap up with the coaching staff, I'll just be honest, I don't have a lot of nuggets here on the coaching staff. I think this has been pretty buttoned up. I do think the Dennis Allen thing is happening, just based on the fact that Adam Schefter tweeted it. Now, I don't know if Darren Rizzi is happening. We'll see what happens there. I think Rizzi's going to be in contention in a couple different places. I don't even think it's impossible he returns to the Saints. I don't think he will, but I do think he is at least in the mix there in New Orleans. You know, he could get a job in a couple different places. We'll see if he ends up in Chicago. I know a lot of Bears fans wanted Hank Fraley. That doesn't seem to be the case. I think, you know, Ben Johnson is going to be, in essence, nice to Dan Campbell and let Hank Fraley stay there instead of bringing him as the offensive coordinator of the team. And finally, the last piece there is Mark Brunell, the former Jaguars quarterback. He, of course, I believe this quarterback coach is what his title is in Detroit. Would Mark Brunell come to the Bears? He was rumored to be going with Aaron Glenn to the Jets job, but it looks like they've pivoted another direction at offensive coordinator there. So Brunell possibly in the mix, because I don't think Brunell's in the mix to be the offensive coordinator in Detroit. And if that's the case, and he can be offensive coordinator in Chicago, he may want to take that jump. So I don't think Ben Johnson is going to raid the cupboard in Detroit. There's been enough of that already. Tyrell Williams, the defensive line coach, is now the defensive coordinator for the Patriots. Obviously, Glenn is gone. You know, Hank Fraley's still in the mix for the Seattle offensive coordinator job. Who knows if he takes that one? So maybe Mark Brunell comes aboard, maybe a low-level assistant, you know, the assistant quarterback coach or some offensive quality control coach that Ben Johnson really vibes with, really likes in Detroit. Maybe someone like that comes with a promotion. But I don't think Ben Johnson's raiding the cupboard in Detroit. I don't think Hank Fraley's coming. I would love to be wrong on that one. That's not information. That's more of a hunch and just kind of reading the tea leaves. But we'll see. Maybe Mark Brunell comes. But again, if Mark Brunell doesn't come, I think Ben Johnson's probably going to have a pretty good plan in place for who his offensive coaching staff is going to be. You know, we've heard maybe Joe Philbin could be in the mix for an offensive line coach. He was the offensive line coach under Antonio Pierce with the Raiders. So I assume he is going to be out of contract and available here shortly. So we'll see what happens here with the coaching staff. I think if Dennis Allen is the guy, indeed, as defensive coordinator, Ben Johnson's probably going to let Dennis Allen bring in most of his guys, so to speak, for those defensive coaches. And Ben Johnson will worry about building the offensive coaches. In terms of who they've brought in, you know, and I hate to say like check boxes, but I do think, you know, there's a Rudy Rule aspect to who the Bears have interviewed. I don't necessarily think those are the guys that are going to end up with the defensive coordinator and offensive coordinator positions in Chicago. So we're going to get to the interview. I'm excited for this. Rick Smith, Ben Johnson's agent, joins me next. This is Bill Zimmerman, Bears Banter. We'll be right back. Welcome back into the podcast. I'm excited for this guest because this is the man behind the man. He is Ben Johnson's agent. He is Rick Smith of Priority Sports. We're going to talk to him about kind of how this went down, how this whole process works, not just for Ben Johnson, but for NFL assistant coaches and future NFL coaches in general. And he joins me now. Rick, Bill Zimmerman, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Bill, great to be here. Now I can put a face to the Twitter page.
Yeah, I'm the one that's not Dick Butkus in that
Right.
picture. So
Exactly.
but first, let me just ask you, because I know you haven't been Ben Johnson's agent too long. I know he joined Priority Sports fairly recently. That's something that went down in the last few months, correct?
It was September.
Okay. So like, I know for players, sometimes they'll have an agency that handles like contract negotiations, and they maybe have someone that does publicity that's different. Like for coaches, like when Ben Johnson changes agents and comes to Priority Sports, is that like all inclusive, or sometimes do they still have other aspects that handle other aspects of their career?
No, it's no different than players at all. I actually represented players for about 25 years. And we opened a coaches division maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And it's full service. It's literally no different at all.
Gotcha. So let me jump into this in terms of the process on how coaches get hired, and anything you want to share about Ben in particular. Fans would love to have it, but this whole process is interesting, and I know the NFL has changed the rules on this to try and slow the process down a little bit and try and give playoff coordinators, a fairer shake here. It's not just chaos the day the last game is played at the end of the regular season. But like in terms of how these coordinators have to balance things in terms of interviews and preparation with the change in the rules, like Todd Monken talking about how he doesn't like having to do it this way, but it is what it is. And what is this process like for you as an agent working with offensive coordinators, defensive coordinators who are potentially looking to become head coaches?
Well, you are correct. In the 6 or 7 years that I've been doing this, it's changed 3 or 4 times. I remember, my head coaches in the league are Dan Campbell, Dan Quinn, and now Ben Johnson. So in this situation, they've definitely prolonged the process. They made the first 2 weeks strictly virtual. No in-person meetings at all unless you are not affiliated with a team. So even if you're a non-playoff team, you still could not interview in person in order to give the guys still playing a fair shake. That being said, that's all really good in theory, but I would say the interviews and the coaching process is just one check mark over a lot of check marks. I'd be happy to go through those with you.
Yeah, I'd love to know what those
Sure.
check marks are.
Sure. So basically, obviously the biggest resume you have is the work you do on the field. Ben being the play caller at Detroit, the Bears have faced him 6 times now in 3 years. So they have a really good feel on his intelligence, his structure, his play calling, et cetera. And that's probably the biggest check mark by far. The second check mark from them is the due diligence that teams do on your client. And as Ryan Poles stated, in the last couple of days, they went deep. They talked to former teammates at North Carolina. They talked to people at BC where Ben was a young guy working through it. Talked to guys at Miami. Talked to guys at Detroit. So they're vetting like crazy.
Okay.
And so that's the second big check mark. And then the third check mark is having that interview and seeing if the perception you have on him matches the reality, from the interview. But the interview isn't the end all be all. Believe me. At the end of the day, some of these guys are really good at interviewing and some of them aren't, and teams I think have gotten away from determining everything based on the interview, for sure.
Interesting. So you think kind of that extensive background check, so to speak, and vetting and getting you're getting to know the candidate before you even have to speak to the candidate.
100%, and the Bears did an exhaustive, not only on Ben, but my God, and I'll get into the 18 interviews because people are misinterpreting that for sure. But yeah, that's just one check mark, and teams are doing a lot better about that, now.
Well, since you brought it up with the extensive list, and I think the request list was up around 21 names, and like you said, they interviewed well into the teens. And I know the Chargers had a huge list before they decided to hire Jim Harbaugh, but we do usually see those 7, 8, maybe 10 kind of is what teams usually go for. Obviously, the Bears went for a lot more. And when I was kind of poking around the league, a lot of people kind of said it felt directionless. And obviously, I think you're going to disagree with that there. So what did you think about the Bears' plan here with so many?
I mean, I have to tell you, okay, I've lived in this town my whole life. Okay, I was going to Bear games as a little kid with my family. I've seen the old Bears. I've seen the dysfunctional Bears. I was a cheerleader for that. But this thing's changed, man. And if you're listening, if this is a Bear-centric podcast, which it is, let me be the guy that breaks the news to all the naysayers that this is the new Bears, 100%. And I absolutely give credit to Kevin Warren for allowing the family to really get a broader aspect of what is going on around the National Football League. You guys have to understand that an NFL building, I don't care if it's the Bears or the other 31, are the most really insulated places, okay? They don't talk to 31 other teams. They really don't know. They hear, but they don't really know what's going on in those buildings, okay? And I do. I talk to 32 teams. And the extensive interviewing process really is such a great learning experience, okay? When you're that insulated and when you really don't have any idea what's going on in these other buildings, you've got 2 weeks of virtual interviews. Nobody's traveling. There's no logistics. You flip a link on and you start talking. The amount of information, the wealth of knowledge you can learn from talking to all those people is, you can't get it in any other forum in the National Football League but a head coaching interview, literally. And you can get it in free agency too, from a player's perspective, but that's a whole different issue, and that's going 100 miles per hour too. And you don't have those interviews with the players. So the coaching side really is that one place. And the Bears did a tremendous job of gathering information, and I'm telling you, a whole lot's come out of that. Ryan and I had a conversation about that the other day, and how much they really learned, they never thought about, that they can maybe incorporate a little bit into how they're moving forward.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you brought up Kevin Warren. So let me ask you about that a little bit, because I think Bears fans for years were frustrated with George McCaskey. I mean, you live in the city, you understand that, and I think part of that frustration came from George saying, "I'm just a fan. I don't know a lot about football," kind of thing. I'm just a fan like everybody else. Whether he's being humble or not, that's what he's saying publicly. And yet he's still the one responsible for assessing football operations and deciding if the general manager and the head coach are the right people for the jobs. And I think bringing Kevin Warren in, who's been with the Rams and the Vikings and the Big Ten commissioner and has such an extensive experience as an executive, I think really allowed George, and you tell me if you agree or disagree, to kind of take a step back, let Kevin kind of assess what's going on within the franchise, business side and football operationally. But yet, once those decisions are made, okay, they're going to retain Ryan Poles, going to hire Ben Johnson, and that's where Kevin Warren then takes a step back and lets football operations do what they need to do without interference from above.
100%. I mean, that's what this was able to, that's what the new structure at the Bears is able to do, is George can just sit back now as the CEO and basically take direction and take suggestions from people who have been around and from football people, and make decisions accordingly. And listen, they didn't blink on any of this. Okay. They didn't blink on the contract negotiation. They didn't blink on the process. They didn't blink on Ben Johnson. I mean, there was no walls put up. There were no impediments you had to walk through. George was well educated. Kevin did a great job of preparing him before it started, of kind of where this is going to go, what the NFL looks like today, both in salary and structure. And I've got all the confidence in the world. And that's, if you want to get into what my job in this whole thing, okay, I'm the information gatherer. Okay. I'm the guy who has to lead the horse to the water. Okay. And then the horse has to drink. So I am on the phone day and night.
I'm sure.
Meetings, talking, vetting. And the Bears, allowed me to ask every hard question that you and other fans have been able to ask. It never can ask directly. Okay. They allowed me to ask those hard questions. And I wasn't shy. I went down to the core
Hmm.
of everything. And they were not offended by it. They allowed me to ask the questions. And what I found in this process is there's a tremendous amount of self-awareness going on at Hallis Hall. They understand the mistakes they've made. I believe in human nature that you don't double and triple down on mistakes, after 3 years. And I think they are absolutely ready to tie themselves at the hip with this new head coach, that this new head coach has a absolute clear vision of the type of player he needs, how to be successful, how to structure it to be successful. And I think they'll be great. The front office will be great partners with the head coach together, moving forward, getting the right personnel in there, getting the guys that fit. And it's not throwing darts. Like, Ben just came from a place in Detroit that had a clear vision of what they were looking for and have hit it out of the park. I think the Bears have that ability to do the same thing. And if I could, if there's any criticism of the last 3 years, and I'm trying to stay away from that,
Fair.
is that I don't think there was really a clear vision at all. And I think you now have it. Like,
Gotcha. So when there's media reports coming out, weeks before the season ended, that Ben Johnson is looking for a franchise that's willing to understand the mistakes they've made and how they are going to correct those moving forward, that's where Rick Smith comes in to ask those hard questions.
Well, I mean, if you would like to know where all that came from, that was the narrative Ben and I set up, and I just planted it.
Okay.
Okay.
So yeah, that came out. I think it was the Thursday Amazon game after Thanksgiving.
Yes.
After Matt Eberflus had been let go by the franchise.
Yes.
That's where that started.
Yeah, and because my job also is to listen. I can't control the internet. It's just it takes there's so many branches to it. It's out of control.
Sure does.
but if you get the narrative out there, people will hang on to it, and that was important that I got that out there. That hey, I'm laying you out the answers to the test. So if you guys are interested in my guy, here's what we're looking for.
Here's the answer key, right?
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you then. While you're talking about the media, let me ask you about this, because, you don't have to say anything in particular, but when I assessed the coaching situation for me in terms of where I thought there were fits for Ben Johnson after teams had made decisions about who they were retaining and who they weren't at the end of the regular season, I kind of looked at it. We heard about Jacksonville, we heard about New England, and we heard about the Bears. That was kind of the initial names we heard, and New England really pivoted to Vrabel quickly. And Jacksonville, I really thought that the Trent Baalke retention there, and I know they've changed. Looks like Liam Cohen's going to be there now, but it really felt like that might be an impediment for Ben to go to Jacksonville. So I kind of looked at it and went, I don't see any other place but Chicago. That's where I was originally. And then the Raiders pop up, and Tom Brady, we hear they let go Tom Telesco, and we hear that was specifically so Ben could get his own GM. And we hear that Brady really sold Ben, and Ben was totally into it, and Raiders. And it went from just kind of this rumble that, hey, Ben might like the Raiders, to it was just a roar going around the media, and people that really have, I think, pretty good information really all thought that Ben's number one choice was the Raiders. And, that's where I was on and posting it on social media as well. So like when you're talking about, like, you planted kind of the answer key right after Thanksgiving, like, is that kind of the same thing to kind of look, Ben wants the Bears, but at the same time, you also need to kind of create a situation where there is some competition in terms of, getting the best contract for your client.
So let's break that down. Okay?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Initial gut reaction day one on the Raiders was no go. Okay. Tom Brady absolutely has a extremely compelling case.
Okay.
That gets you to listen. Okay. The whole thing, bend to the Raiders, great sources, all the other stuff. No, that was never right. However, sometimes, again, going back to my job, sometimes things go viral that you're like, I got to put a break on this, and sometimes thing goes viral like no, this is good. I like this. And that viral thing was, I like this. Let's just leave that out there. Okay. Ben made a decision Monday morning.
Monday morning after the Lions lost?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That was the first time we ever ranked the teams. The first time. We weren't ready to do that, and I wouldn't let him do that. Because the problem is, if you go in with before I gather all my information, and those are numerous conversations with Jacksonville, with Chicago, with the Raiders, right? It takes a while to get all your questions answered. It's not one phone call.
Sure.
The goalpost is constantly moving in this thing, okay, constantly. And it's several phone calls. And the Sunday night after the Lions were defeated by the Commanders was the first time that I was able to finally complete to make Ben a presentation and his wife, a presentation of all of the information, allow him to ask questions, allow him to be able to make an informed decision. He woke up Monday morning, called me at, I don't know what time it was in the morning, and said, call the Bears and see if you can get a deal done.
Wow. And you got a deal done quickly, because that this obviously all came together really quickly. So, I mean, while we're talking about Ben, I mean, George McCaskey afterwards, said that Ben Johnson in the interview said, at the beginning and at the end, hey, I want this job. We even heard, rumors before he was even with you, he was one of your clients, that this was a job he was monitoring last year, potentially. I know Ben said, he wouldn't have taken the job if it was available last year. He wasn't ready, or he didn't want to move his family yet. I don't remember the exact wording, but whether it doesn't matter whether he would have done that last year or not anyway at this point, because it wasn't available and he's here now. But just with kind of all that, this is clearly a position, since the Bears landed the number 1 pick last year. This is kind of at least a job I think he's been monitoring, I guess you could say, to see if there might be a potential fit there.
Yeah, you know what? It's like everything else in life. He 100% wanted this job. He 100% told George the same thing. And those were real words, and then it's gut check time. You know what I'm saying? Now it's like, okay, dude, time to make a decision. And that's where his mind and heart went back to. So, no, he never wavered on that. But it was more me forcing him, because these are monumental decisions, right?
Sure.
Monumental. He's 38 years old. It's monumental decisions, and I made him dig deep. And then he didn't waver. I mean, I think I never asked him, by the way, because I didn't want to. I didn't want him to, but his heart was always with the Bears, and it went back there when it was gut check time.
All right. Well, let me just ask this one from a business perspective to an agent. When your client tells his potential future employer that he wants the job twice in an interview process, how do you keep, any ounce of leverage to try? Look, you want, and obviously to maximize the contract for your client. How do you keep leverage when the Bears can sit there and say, well, he said he wants the job?
Because I've got 3 balls in the air.
What do you mean by that?
I got, the Raiders are interested. Jacksonville's interested.
Gotcha.
I still have that, So at the end of the day, the Bears know. I mean, the Bears were always going to do the right thing. Like I said before, this wasn't a knockdown, drag out. They started low, I go high. They go up, I go down a little. We zeroed in on this thing like on both sides immediately.
Seems like it, yeah.
And we just tweaked it a little bit here and there, but no, it was not that. So leverage goes both ways. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, the Bears could try to leverage me, but then I could also go to three teams and said, put an offer on the table. And I'm like, well, this team's got this. I don't do that. That's not my style. I think that's a BS way of doing business. So basically, I go one, two, three, or whatever it is, and go to the first team he wants to go to, which was the Bears. And I say, all right, let's get a deal done right now. They know that if they can't, then I'm going to two. So it's not a leverage game; it's a reality game.
Gotcha.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, sometimes agents, think they're smarter than the world and they play fake leverage. But man, you get caught in that game, you're not going to have a client real quick. So,
Yeah, sure. That could
no,
backfire.
this was perfect. His heart was with the Bears, and he never wavered off that.
Gotcha. Let me ask you a couple other things here before we wrap up.
Sure.
While you were talking about how you planted the playbook, so to speak, right after Thanksgiving, one of the other things we heard about was GM alignment. And while you can figure out some of what that is, it's kind of generic enough that I don't think anyone quite knew what that meant. And I think, when the Raiders let go Telesco, they're like, oh, well, that's what that means. He wants to start in the same place with the GM. And clearly that's not the case because he's here with Ryan Poles.
Here's the way it is. Listen, I think for Ryan too and Ben, the Bears set up an incredible process. It was so good. It was the best I've seen really in my time, because the first part of that interview was a one-on-one between Ben and Ryan. Nobody else was on that Zoom call. Then it shifted to the group, which was a great group, by the way. It was George, Kevin, it was Ryan, it was Jeff King, who's the unsung hero in all of this. Jeff King, who's, I don't even know what his title is, director of player personnel, senior, he is the unsung hero in all of this, because I represented Jeff his whole career. So he got me really comfortable really quick. And that was really the group. That was it. And Ted Cruz was the fifth. So when Ryan and Ben had that one-on-one, that was a place where they both can see if they were comfortable with each other. And when that interview concluded, the first words out of Ben's mouth was, I really feel comfortable with Ryan. I believe that I can work with him. So what GM alignment means is, here's what it means, okay? Everybody's in love with the guys they sign, right? Everybody's in love with the draft picks they draft.
Sure.
However, you have a new coach with a new vision, right? So if certain guys fit within that vision, great, let's roll. If certain guys don't fit within that vision, then you got to find guys that do. So is the GM going to be entrenched and basically tell the coach, hey, these guys are untouchable. These guys, that's not the coach's vision. That's the coach having to fit into the old vision. So alignment means that, can we build a football team based on this vision I have that I know is going to be successful? That's what alignment means. And is the GM willing to check his ego at the door, as the coach is willing to check his ego at the door, so that they get in the same boat and row in the same direction? That's what alignment means. Not picking your own guy. That is not what alignment means.
Gotcha. Yeah, and obviously that's the case. But yeah, you just saw media kind of speculating exactly what that meant. So
100%.
Let me ask you this: as Ben Johnson now he's starting to put together his staff, and Adam Schefter's already reporting some potential coordinators that might be coming to Chicago with Ben, but at the same time, he loves Dan Campbell. He respects Dan Campbell. He doesn't want to try and raid the cupboard there and leave Detroit with nothing. So how does that go? What are the challenges of a new, coach who doesn't, I know Ben's got a pretty good network, but he doesn't have a network like Pete Carroll, who, looks like he's headed to the Raiders, obviously, and has been a head coach for so many years. How do you go about putting together a staff, which is obviously an extensive coaching staff, when you're kind of starting from scratch?
It's a little bit of a difficult process, because you have one pool of guys that are out of work because they were on staffs of teams that just were released. So you've got that pool of guys. Then there's then there's a whole pool of guys who are under contract with other teams that you have to get permission. And oftentimes the teams won't give you permission to talk to
Sure.
those guys. So you have to putting your final staff together is usually a couple year process, not right now. That's why you see so many changes on staffs after the first year, because
Mm.
as your pool widens, you now may have some ability to get guys you couldn't get before, and you haven't until your staff starts working together. And as I say, when the bullets start flying, when the season starts, a head coach has to evaluate that staff. So that's why you see a lot of changes in the first year, because you just can't get everybody you want to get.
Gotcha. Now, I mean, in those, and you don't have to say specifically for the Bears, more of a general question.
Sure.
When someone like Ben Johnson, Dan Campbell, trying to be, I know Campbell had the interim, but being a first head coach like that, when they're sitting down on that initial interview, like, is it usually an idea? Hey, this is kind of who I'm thinking. I know you can't say for sure I'm bringing this guy because there could be contract issues, blocks, whatever it might be. Like, kind of having an idea at least who you'd like at like the top of your coaching staff. Is that usually something coaches
100%.
kind of already have a plan in place for?
100%. And everybody knows there's caveats to that, but yes, some guys basically, go through a list of 3 or 4 guys for the coordinator positions, and then other guys will go deep into every position and have 3 or 4 guys. It just really depends on the coach. But, for me, for my guys, I think the most important thing is to get your coordinators in place, and then now involve your coordinators in putting the staff together, because that staff will work for those coordinators. I mean, your offensive coordinator is your head coach on offense, your defensive coordinator, head coach on defense, your special teams coordinator is a head coach on special teams. You're the CEO who's overlooking all of it. So those guys need to have input, and it's just helpful to get those guys in place first and then start building from there.
Gotcha. I wanted to ask you one thing, and this is more of a
Sure.
general question, not anything
Sure.
specific with the Bears, and that's the Rooney Rule, because I think the spirit of it, I think it's a really good idea, and I do think it has helped in several aspects, but at the same time we're seeing minority candidates really only coming from the defensive side of the ball. They're rarely coming from the offensive side of the ball, and we see more offensive guys getting elevated to those head coaching positions. Not extensively, not exclusively, I should say, but more, the majority are on the offensive side of the ball. And we're seeing, just teams check boxes without much of a thought. There's reports out how Jacksonville just manipulated the Rooney Rule so they could get Liam Cohen done. The Bears, I think the Eddie George interview was interesting because he's done a great job at Tennessee State. He was part of the Bill Walsh coaching internship with Chicago, and give him a chance to kind of elevate his name in coaching circles. But, if I'm just being honest, if I just, see Pep Hamilton's name come up one more time in another year, like I just feel like it's not getting what the spirit of the rule isn't getting accomplished.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think a lot of the minority coaches feel the same. The NFL's trying. It just keeps falling flat on its face. And I don't really, I have 1,000 ideas for a different podcast, but it's just, yes, I agree with you 1,000%. I think this thing is failing miserably. And I think it's doing a disservice to minority coaches personally.
Yeah, it really has gotten them. And last thing I want to ask you is,
Sure.
I'm curious, did you see the Kalen Kaler piece in ESPN about coaches, about agents and coaches and the coaching searches?
I sure did. Yeah.
Do you, as an agent of coaches, is that something, do you think there were valid points there? Do you think it was maybe overblown? I mean, obviously everyone knows the Bears did have a very close working relationship with Trace Armstrong. Ryan Poles is still in the building. But I thought it was an interesting, for fans that don't really know a lot about this kind of stuff behind the scenes, I do think it was interesting. I was just curious to get your reaction.
I guess the best way I can describe it is, yes, I read it. Yes, I think there was a lot of validity in it. And I just think we all have different styles. And the position I always took was, there's plenty of coaches for all of us who are competing against each other in the business. And you got to do things the way you're comfortable doing, and the way, ultimately we serve our clients. So all I really care about is doing right by them. I don't pay a lot of attention what other agents are doing because I don't represent their players, nor do I care about what they're doing. I know I've been around this thing so darn long that I think I know exactly what works for me and works for and ultimately it's the service to my clients. That's all I care about. So I do it different than those guys do it. Not saying one's right and one's wrong. It's just different styles.
Gotcha. All right. Well, there he is. I could talk to you all day, but it's already been a half hour, so I'll let you go. Rick Smith, Ben Johnson's agent, the man that helped facilitate the future of the Chicago Bears into the position of head coach. Rick, thanks for so much time. That was a great interview. Really eye-opening. I really appreciate it.
Let's go with the legend, okay? I want to be known as the legend now.
The legend. There, the legendary Rick.
There we go. Beautiful. All right. Thanks, Guy. I appreciate you, Bill. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
There he is, Rick Smith. I was looking forward to that interview. That was a phenomenal interview. Like, if you wanted to know how the Bears landed Ben Johnson, he gave you, he was more transparent than I thought he was. He said he would be transparent, but he was more transparent than I thought he would be. I mean, flat out told you he planted that stuff after Thanksgiving about GM alignment and that the team would have to be able to understand the mistakes they've made and how to correct them. You know, said he didn't plant the Raiders smoke, but he let it just, go viral because it was only going to help his client. How they go about putting together coaching staffs, and they don't really get their full staff for 2 years. Ben Johnson called him Monday morning after the Commanders beat them and said, get a deal done with the Bears. Like, Kevin Warren being a key agent of change there, as I've been saying, at Hallis Hall. Like, all those pieces of information. I mean, that was an absolutely fantastic interview, learning how this process works, what goes into it, where the agent plays. That was great. I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. That I don't think that interview could have gone any better. So there he is, Rick Smith, Priority Sports, Ben Johnson's agent. All right, let's get to the mailbag. There's a lot of these. I don't know how much information I have to share, but I will share as much as I can. How about Adrian? How worried are you about Ben Johnson's ability to construct a coaching staff? I'm not worried, Adrian, and you just heard it there. It may take a couple of years for him to get all his pieces in place. This is a guy who has worked in Detroit for several years, worked in Miami. His agent, Rick Smith, is going to have some contacts with people around the league if he brings in Dennis Allen. Dennis Allen has a lot of contacts around the league. So I think it's going to come together. I don't think he's going to necessarily raid the cupboard in Detroit, but I do think it's going to come together. It may not be names you're going to be wowed by. You might be like, oh, I don't know about that guy. It might be his offense coordinator. It might be a passing game coordinator who's getting a promotion, something like that. So we'll see how this plays out. But yeah, I am not too concerned about it. All right. At Omega Jolton, Edward says, is Dennis Allen a foregone conclusion as DC? And do you think Ashton Genty at 10 is more likely with how it went down with them trading Swift and Gibbs? Will Swift be on the team next year? All right, so we got about 3 questions there, Edward. Let's see. Will Swift be on the team next year? I believe he will be. You can't really cut him. You're going to eat a ton of money on that. I do agree Ben Johnson may not be copacetic there with Swift as his main running back. I could see kind of what happened with Swift in Detroit. We saw Jamal Williams kind of became the main running back and Swift became a complementary back. I could see that happening this year where the Bears find a different RB1 and move Swift into the RB2 role, change of pace role. And then, probably after this season when the guaranteed money is pretty much gone, yes, they probably move on from DeAndre Swift. Is Dennis Allen a foregone conclusion? It feels like it. That's not something I could have asked Rick Smith. Unfortunately, that's not something he's going to be at liberty to share. But, it does seem like that is something that's going to be announced real soon. And as for Genty, I think that depends on what the Bears do in free agency with offensive line. I'm sure Ben Johnson knows the priority there needs to be offensive line. The question is, do they have that solved in free agency where they're comfortable going a different direction at 10 and they can pick up, some offensive line depth later in the draft? Or is it something where they still need to grab a Will Campbell type at 10 and they can't consider Genty? Personally, for me, Genty's got a lot of wear on those legs. I think this is a phenomenal running back class. I would be kind of frustrated if they took Genty at 10, because I think there are some great running backs later in the draft that you would be able to get in the third, maybe fourth round that I think are going to be, very strong running backs in the NFL. So I would prefer if they went another direction. We'll see if they need to go offensive line, but Genty's a special talent. I'm not going to deny that. I just think better choice than running back in round one for me. Chris Armstrong, he told us the offense would be different than what he ran in Detroit, but the inclusion of Jameson Williams into that offense made a huge difference. Would you expect to see the Bears pursue a speedy receiver? I think they will. I'd agree with you, Chris. I think they will too. I don't think Keenan Allen's probably going to be back here unless he wants to take a really, really affordable offer, which maybe he will. But I do think Keenan Allen would probably like to make his way back to California if he can. Would the Chargers take him back? Would the Rams take him? I don't know what's going to happen with the future of Keenan Allen. But I think with Cole Kmet and, DJ Moore being able to handle screens around the line of scrimmage, Cole Kmet, being able to be that safety blanket guy, Laporta was a huge part of that offense a lot in Detroit. I think, Kmet could fit into that role potentially there. And yeah, you don't have that speed option unless they really believe Tyler Scott can become something in year 3. Usually, if this is where you're at after 2 years, probably not going to see that jump. But, will they pursue, a second round or third round wide receiver that's got, some burners there? Will they go kind of a lower end free agent that they think they can get a speedy guy and get them 500 yards and be a deep threat? I think that is probably on the table, Chris. I don't know what direction they would go and how to obtain it, but I would have a hard time believing that Tyler Scott would be their only answer there. Beef 209, has your opinion about Poles changed after making this hire? I was ambivalent to skeptical about retaining him, but having Ben Johnson as a partner makes me more comfortable. Is it a surprise Poles wasn't let go, since everyone assumed Ben Johnson wanted his own GM for alignment? Well, you heard it there from Rick Smith. Alignment did not necessarily mean to have, his own GM. It was about shared vision and all that kind of stuff, which he has with Ryan Poles. So I think that whole aspect has been interesting in terms of the Poles dynamic with Johnson. Obviously, Johnson's comfortable with it, or he wouldn't be here. But is my opinion about Poles changed? And I actually said this at the top of the podcast. No, because I need to see about his evaluations. Because right now, I think the evaluations are he's conservative. He doesn't swing for blue chip guys potentially when he has an opportunity to. The Montez Sweat, he gave up a second round pick for Montez Sweat and gave him a huge contract, which I understand you wanted to secure that guy. And if you didn't trade for Montez Sweat, he probably would have gone to the Falcons and signed an extension there. But is Montez Sweat at his money? Would Jonathan Grenard have been a better option where you don't have to give up a draft pick? Those type of things you have to consider. Tyreek Stevenson regressed in year 2. His decision to not have a lot of depth on the defensive line, thinking that Zach Pickens as his third defensive tackle was going to be adequate after a woeful rookie season on tape. The decision to sign Nate Davis, even though his coaching staff told him not to. There's a bunch of things here with Ryan Poles that, and again, maybe Ben Johnson is a really good evaluator of talent, and together they can stabilize that better and get better quality prospects and free agents in here. But right now, I think the Ben Johnson, I think the Ryan Poles track record with his talent acquisition is a little spotty. Clayton Connis, what would you set the current odds at for the likelihood of Ben Johnson getting a contract extension when the time comes? All right, well, that's interesting. I mean, we're really projecting ahead here, but look, I think you probably got about 11 or 12 coaches in the NFL right now that are operating on a second contract or more, second or third contract extension. However, obviously, John Harbaugh has been there, 20 years basically in Baltimore. So obviously that's multiple contract extensions. But I think there's 11 or 12 that are on their second contract. So that's 18 thereabouts, or I should say 20 NFL coaches that are on their first contract. So you're talking about 2/3 of the league still operating on their first contracts. How many of those guys are going to get deals? A quarter of them, so to speak. So if 25%, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, if 25% of new coaches get contract extensions, I think Ben Johnson is more likely to get a contract extension than that. You could say 50-50, but in my confidence, I will say that it is a 60 to 70% chance that Ben Johnson gets a second contract with the Chicago Bears, because that would mean he is humming with Caleb Williams. I'm Little John. Have you heard anything about the guys they have requested to interview for the DC position? I don't know too much about them, if I'm being perfectly honest. And again, I do think Dennis Allen is going to be the guy that ends up being there. Michael Rowland, looking ahead to free agency, who do you see as targets that would also align with Johnson's scheme? Again, we don't know exactly how this scheme is going to look, because he's going to change it a little bit to fit with Caleb Williams. But what I do know is nothing's going to change. Everybody blocks. Wide receivers, tight ends, running backs, everybody blocks. If you don't want to block, Ben Johnson's not going to want you there. DJ Moore, sometimes he blocks, sometimes he doesn't. He's going to have to wake up in that regard. Rome Odunze likes to block. Cole Kmet likes to block. They need to get better at it, but they're willing to block. Travis Homer was a guy who blocks. Roschon Johnson is, Travis Homer is going to be a free agent. Roschon Johnson is a guy who blocks. So is Roschon Johnson going to be retained? I would certainly think so. We're going to see that. Obviously, we're going to want to see his, improvement along the offensive line. I do think Trey Smith is going to be an option there. And I think Trey Smith probably does reach free agency. I've been saying that for the last few months, but we did mention it before. He probably is going to want a little more speed at wide receiver. And we'll go from there. I mean, as of right now, when you look at this team in terms of, what they can add, they could potentially add a running back, which I think is a distinct possibility. They're set at quarterback. They've got 2 wide receivers, so maybe a third receiver. They've got a tight end. They could use a second tight end. They've got 2 tackles that I would assume are going to remain in the starting positions. And then you got the 3 interior guys. So in terms of the top, say, 15 or so on offense, there's only room for 3 or 4 here. So I don't think we're going to see a wild swing here in free agency in the draft. I think we're going to see, Ben Johnson grab a few key guys that he thinks can help his offense. Charlie B., what do you think? What's your opinion of the Lions fan outrage at Ben choosing the Bears? I think they can shut up and get a life. Seriously. Ben Johnson got a huge contract to coach Caleb Williams in a city he likes. Yes, it's in the same division as Detroit. Dan Campbell, you think Dan Campbell is saying F Ben Johnson, I hate him now? No, he's not. So Lions fans, shut up. You're only upset because you're afraid he's going to start beating you. That's it. That's why you're upset. You're not actually upset about anything else. If you thought the Bears were a joke and were going to remain in the basement, you wouldn't care about Ben Johnson coming to Chicago. But because Ben Johnson is here with Caleb Williams, you're afraid they could actually start ruling the North in a couple years, and that your reign will be over before you ever even, reach the Super Bowl, which I'm sorry you've never reached one. We've only reached 2. So it sucks, but get over it. Everyone told you all season you were going to lose Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn, and now you have. Now you're going to see what Dan Campbell's made of, and we'll go from there. Billy Kidd. Bill, I'm holding back on my all-in enthusiasm for the Ben hire. I was all in on Fox. I was all in on Nagy. The Flus hire. I need to see W's first, change my mind. All right. You shouldn't have been all in on Eberflus. That was an uninspired hire. I mean, I still remember being on there with Robert Schmitz and just kind of going, we'll wait and see. That was not a good hire. I was all in on Matt Nagy. Matt Nagy, when adversity hit, He didn't have the quarterback he needed. Things fell apart. But Matt Nagy, he got off to a great start. And it was Vic Fangio. Mitch Trubisky is nowhere. He is mop-up time in Week 18 for Buffalo. But Mitch Trubisky threw, 24 touchdown passes and threw for 3,300 yards with Matt Nagy. They got off to a good start. They just couldn't maintain it when Matt Nagy tried to really put his offense together. John Fox was just kind of the agent of change. He was brought in because Mark Trestman, the Bears football operations, was in shambles. John Fox was a veteran that came in to get things right. Ryan Pace, I don't think, ever really wanted him. John Fox was never going to win in Chicago. He was bad here, but he was never going to win. His job was to bring in Fangio, bring in Adam Gase, get a good coaching staff, get the team operating in a professional manner again. And then when Pace got his quarterback and Mitch Trubisky, he blew Fox out. That's basically how that was. So the Fox hire was part of a long rebuild. The Nagy hire was supposed to be great, and it didn't quite pan out. The Eberflus hire was a bad hire. Like, I mean, it just wasn't good. We don't need to get into it. We don't need to just bag on old Matty there. But yeah. So in terms of this, it's the best coordinator out there, guys. It's the best coaching prospect out there. It's a big deal that they landed him. They ponied up. They did a hell of a job. So embrace it. The Bears have a great quarterback and a great head coach. And, the potential, I should say, for a great quarterback and a great head coach. Nobody thought Mitch Trubisky was going to be great. Everyone, even Matt Nagy, I remember as a producer, I was at Sirius XM at the time, and I booked Matt Nagy to come on a Mad Dog radio show. And our host asked Nagy, who do you think Mitch Trubisky could be? Like, who's your comp if everything works out? He said Alex Smith. And I remember just listening to that and going, Alex Smith? And I know Alex Smith had a nice run in Kansas City, and Nagy loved him because Smith was a real cerebral quarterback. That, you want to hear Aaron Rodgers there. You want to hear Drew Brees. That's what Tom Brady, Peyton Manning. That's what you want to hear. Alex Smith. So you can tell Matt Nagy knew Mitch Trubisky was limited. So in terms of having this great quarterback and great offensive mind, this is uncharted territory, guys. Embrace it. Enjoy it. Yeah, you might get disappointed, but you might really, really have something special cooking here in Chicago. All right, Martin, what was the Raiders' nonsense about? Ben Johnson is very smart. Why would he go to a team with no front office and no QB? Was the fake news started by his agent to increase his value? Martin, I don't need to answer that. Rick Smith did. So there you go. He didn't create the smoke, but he let it billow, and he let that fire rage out of control because it was only going to help him. So yes, Ben was too smart to take the Raiders job, but his agent was too smart to tell people that wasn't true. Jake Noseball, what are you hearing about Trey Smith and hitting free agency? As I just said, I think he will hit free agency. If you want Trey Smith, you're going to have to give him like $24, $25 million a year. The Bears are that enamored with him and think that's the guy that they need to stabilize the interior of their offensive line. I think they'll pony up, and I think the idea of coming to Chicago with Ben Johnson, who has a great run scheme, and with Caleb Williams, I think is going to be very appealing to someone like Trey Smith if, in fact, he leaves Kansas City, and I think he will. Casey Ullman, who are some of the names to keep on outside of those already in the news for filling out Johnson's staff? The only one I'll throw out there, and I don't know how much validity it has, is Joe Philbin. He's going to be let go, I would assume, by the Raiders when they, with Pete Carroll comes in here. And he could be the offensive line coach for the Bears. Other than that, I think it's very early in the process. You need the coordinators in place. And then once the coordinators are in place, they will be involved in hiring all the other assistant coaches. Like if Dennis Allen is hired, Ben Johnson's probably just gonna be like, all right, Dennis, bring in your defensive guys. He may have a guy or two in mind that he'd like on the staff, but he's going to give Dennis Allen reign to bring in his guys that he's comfortable with. On the offensive side of the ball, it doesn't seem like they're retaining pretty much anybody. So Ben Johnson's going to come in with a clean slate. And like Rick Smith said, it's going to take a couple years for Ben Johnson to bring in all the guys he wants. All right, Dolmite, why were you so pessimistic about getting Ben, and what are you hearing about Ben's staff? Again, Ben's staff, I'm not going to speculate on too much. I haven't heard anything that's really valid other than the stuff that's already been floated out there. Again, I don't think they're going to raid Detroit's cupboard. I think we'll see where it goes, and we'll go from there. And again, pessimistic. Again, why? Because people I trust, people that have given me information that has been 100% accurate, they told me the Raiders smoke was real. So that's why I was so pessimistic, because I trusted the people who are usually correct. We got another question about Trey Smith. Is it playoffs or bust, says Master Legend 23 in 2025? I don't think it has to be playoffs or bust, because keep in mind, this is a 5-12 team. They go 9-8 and they're in the hunt the last couple of weeks. That's going to be a successful season. So it is not playoffs or bust. It would be playoffs or bust in 2026, but 2025, you can still call it a developmental year. All right, that'll do it for Bears Banter. Lengthy episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I thought, again, Rick Smith was awesome. I am going to listen to that interview a couple extra times because it was so good. Bear down, everybody. We will be back again. I will be in New Orleans for the Super Bowl. If there's any Bears content available down there, I will get you some mini podcasts as I've done in the past. We'll see. 5-12 Bears players may not want to talk much about Matt Eberflus, so they may not be down there. But again, they may be embracing the Ben Johnson, and they're going to want to talk about their new coach. We will see. But we'll have another podcast when we have another podcast. Bear down, everybody. Adios.